Hi, everyone. As everyone is coming into the webinar, I'd like to welcome you to the Johns Hopkins AITC. And this is done in collaboration with the A2 Collective and our colleagues at UPenn and UMass. So my name is Phan. I'm a professor at the Carey Business School with a joint appointment in the Department of Medicine at Johns Hopkins. The work that I do focuses on patient safety and quality with a particular interest in transitions of care. I'm currently the director of the Networking and Mentoring Core of the JH-AITC. And today I'm going to talk about revenue and reimbursement strategy. So revenue and reimbursement are related to one another, although they are somewhat different. And so that's why I want to talk about them together and separately as well. For those of you who are developing technologies that you think could be reimbursable, I think this is a useful, hopefully this will be a useful webinar for you. Now, just very quickly in terms of housekeeping, please type your questions into the chat. There is a like a Q&A box and a chat box. The chat box is more efficient. And Ann Wicker, who's here with me, will be monitoring the chat box. And as time permits and as opportunity permits, she will be fielding those questions to me. Again, if we are not able to get to your questions in this webinar, I will be sure to answer them in an FAQ after the webinar, and we will post it on our website so that everybody will have access to it. The slide deck will also be made available on the website after the seminar, and this session is actually being recorded, and that will also be made available to you for review. There's a lot of stuff I'm going to be covering today, and I may have to be somewhat quick, and therefore I want to make sure that we get through the material. Okay, so I just got a note saying the chat is disabled. Fine. Thank you for letting me know. Then just type your questions into the question and answer box, and we will be sure to get to that. All right, so very quickly, some disclosures. I'm a co-founder of 2 companies, and I'm also funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I don't believe there are any conflicts with related to this particular webinar, but just so you know. All right, so the learning objectives for this webinar today is to think about the role of the revenue model in the business model, and then to discuss very briefly the difference between the revenue model and revenue streams, right? Again, they're related, but they're actually different things, and it's important to understand what those things are because it's going to be critical for you to build your financial projections, right? And then ultimately, whether your invention or your project is going to make money or not on a commercial basis will depend on how you think about your revenue model and the revenue streams that are supporting the model. Then I'm going to go into a deeper discussion about reimbursement strategy as either a revenue model, so that's all you do, or as a revenue stream in your overall revenue model. And I'm actually going to be talking a little bit in greater depth about the relationship between reimbursement strategy and product design. And this is actually fairly important because although we think of reimbursement as a revenue source, a revenue stream, in fact, whether you end up being reimbursable or not is going to be, it's going to depend on your product design. And your product design is going to depend on what is actually out there in the reimbursement landscape. So I think this is going to be important. And I'm going to make a big point about this because when you're designing your technology, what you do not want to do, and I'll repeat this at the end of the webinar, what you do not want to do is to go and design the thing, right? Pilot tested, etc., market tested, and then figure out if you want to get it reimbursed, or then, think about reimbursement after the fact. All right, that would be a mistake. And a lot of companies have fallen into that trap and ended up not being able to participate in the market, either because their primary revenue stream was reimbursement, or that they were hoping reimbursement would make up part of the revenue model, and that's sort of just not available to them. Okay, so I think that's going to be really important. All right, so very quickly, we start with some basic definitions of what a business model is. And, I would have mentioned this in a previous webinar, but just to reiterate, we need to be clear in our mind two things that we do as you're building out your product, as you're building out your technology. You need to think about what you are actually selling, like what is the solution, to whom and where, right? That's the unmet need statement. And you want to be very, very clear, because what is an unmet need is going to depend on who you're trying to meet the need for, and then there might be a geographic or a temporal dimension to that. And then the second piece of your business model is how you actually make, and I would include that, distribute the products and services you sell. Okay, so the first is sort of the target of your technology, the target market for your technology. And the second one is how do you actually, embody the technology in products and services and get it to that market. That's your business model. It's not that complicated, but obviously within that, you have to do a lot of work to actually validate the different elements of your model. And then the final piece of it is, well, how much money do you need actually to start this thing, to operate it, and to grow your venture? Okay, so I'm not going to be talking about the sort of second two bullet points. I'm in fact going to be more focused on the first bullet point, which is, the revenue aspect of it. And I've mentioned in a previous webinar that the revenue projections of your business model are probably going to be the least certain and will be subject to the riskiest assumptions. For the most part, how much it's going to cost you to make something. You probably are going to know how much it will cost you to actually distribute it, because distribution channels exist, whether it's online, whether it's physical products, logistics, etc. All that is actually knowable, right? You know those things, and that gives you the basic cost of your enterprise. What is more difficult to know, and which you have to forecast, is how much money you're actually going to make, when you're going to make it, and whether the money that you're going to make is going to grow or remain, as a stable number. That piece is usually the one that trips up a lot of entrepreneurs as they're trying to figure out whether their business is going to be profitable or not, and more importantly, how valuable the business is going to be, because the value of your enterprise is going to determine the ease with which you are going to raise money to actually get it going, right? So it's a very important aspect of your commercialization plan you got to pay attention to. So as I said, focusing on the revenue drivers, there's sort of two major dimensions of revenue that you really want to pay attention to. The first, obviously, would be the size, how important the particular revenue stream is. How many revenue streams, or the combination of revenue streams, which is the second bullet point. How predictable your revenue is, how cyclical or non-cyclical it is, and whether it's growing or not. All right, so understanding, if you will, the characteristics of each revenue stream and the combination of these streams, which are essentially the sources of revenue from sales, direct sales, or fees, or advertising, or subscriptions. And there are lots of examples of different kinds of revenue streams. The combination of these things and their characteristics in terms of growth, cyclicality, predictability, altogether comprise your revenue model. Okay, so now obviously when you're starting out, you're not going to have too many revenue streams. So you really shouldn't be thinking of too many revenue streams, because that complicates, if you will, the design of your business enterprise. So you want to think about one or two revenue streams that will provide the source of income to allow you to stabilize the enterprise and then to eventually grow it. And you can add new revenue streams as you find different applications for your technology, different target markets, or if you extend your technology into different versions of the product. All those things are obviously very doable once you have established yourself in the industry. So as I said, the revenue model includes a few dimensions which you have to think about when you're planning your business model, when you're planning your commercialization strategy. How periodic, how are your customers going to buy your product or service? So if you think about periodicity, right, one of the reasons why subscription models are so popular nowadays is because they're stable, they're predictable, right? So all you have to do is manage your subscription base. Everybody's going towards subscriptions now. And more importantly, there are sort of some behavioral aspects to subscriptions, and people tend to not desubscribe as rapidly or as people tend to not desubscribe once you have a subscription. I mean, marketers sort of figured that out. And that's why companies use subscriptions models very regularly nowadays, right? Things that may have been sold on a piece-by-piece basis, even things like shavers and toothbrushes, have now come under a subscription model type of a revenue stream. And then other things like whether it's predictable or not, the size of each sale. If you're selling an MRI machine, for example, you're not likely going to sell it on a subscription basis. However, you could probably sell a maintenance contract on a subscription basis, right? The machine itself is it's a sort of a rare event purchase, if you will, but it's a big amount. And therefore the sales cycle tends to be much longer, and therefore it's probably less predictable, right? But once you sell the machine, then the maintenance is more predictable, and this is where the subscription model comes in. So these are the things that will be driven partially by the technology itself, right? The market that it's serving, and then it's also partially driven by your strategy. So you can actually decide how you want to make money. So from the standpoint of revenue streams, I mentioned a few things, but there are lots of different ways of actually making money from your product. And you want to think about this ahead of time, because the way you design how your product is actually sold, and I would even argue the design of the product itself, is going to be partially determined by how you think you want to sell it, right? So whether you use materials that are disposable or whether you use materials that are more permanent, more enduring, is going to be driven by how you think you're going to be selling it, either on a subscription basis, for example, or a one-time purchase basis. So here are some examples. And again, as I said, I'm not going to go through all of these things. I'll have the deck available to you, and you can actually adapt a lot of these examples to your own business. And these are just a few examples. I mean, literally, the way you can make money from your technology, even in instances where you think you're going to use a reimbursement model, but the way you're going to make money is about as plentiful as creative, as your creativity. All right, and that's the point I'm trying to get across here, that there's no one best way for the most part to make money. All right, there are more profitable ways, there are less risky ways, but you can sort of think about how your competitors are currently selling their products and services, and you could figure out a way to innovate away from that to avoid competition. So in terms of digital health, I know a number of you are focused on digital health, and that's sort of an interesting, I would even argue, emerging domain. There are lots of digital technologies that are out there. I'm not entirely convinced that there has yet been a good, stable set of revenue models that typify this technology. There's a lot of experimentation going on. Right? Here's some examples, right? So you have sort of prescription digital therapeutics, right? So you're basically selling a digital therapeutic on a prescription. These are reimbursed basis. You can sell your product through an employer. So in this case, the employer actually pays for the use of your digital product to benefit their employees. You can sell it through a payer. So in this case, the payer is paying. So you have an insurance company that believes that adopting your product could lower claims by improving, health and well-being of their policyholders. You can, of course, sell the data to a pharmaceutical company that might find it valuable, say for post-marketing surveillance, let's say, which is sort of a thing now with lots of, pharmaceutical companies have to do post-market surveillance. That's sort of part of the requirement, right, for the post-market approval process. However, they've discovered that by doing a good job at post-market surveillance, they could maybe even find good off-label indications that could then become on-label indications by the appropriate applications, right, to the FDA. So they actually pay for data because that could represent new revenue streams for them. And then, of course, direct to consumer, where you're selling directly to the consumer. A lot of mental health apps, for example, do that kind of thing. So with that, let me move to reimbursement strategy. Because as I said, I want to spend a little bit of time on this issue of reimbursement, since a number of you might be considering that as a potential revenue stream. Okay, so as we all know, just because you have a code does not mean you get reimbursed, right? So just because a code exists for your idea or your technology or your service doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to get reimbursed, right? Whether something gets reimbursed or not depends on three things. So the reimbursement mechanism, and this is fairly similar around the world, right? So even though I'm talking about this as though I'm discussing what the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare might do from a reimbursement standpoint, this logic, this paradigm is pretty common around the world, right? So there's sort of three aspects to the payment system. One is the code, obviously, right? What is actually covered. The second aspect is the coverage, which is how much of it is covered. And then, let me go back. So the first is the code, which is what is actually being covered, right? The second is coverage, which is what is being covered, as well as the circumstances or the conditions under which what is being covered is actually covered. So, for example, a code for a pediatric, device may not be covered if the device was used for adults, for example, right? So the coverage is very specific. And so if you're going to be looking for reimbursement for your device or for your therapy or your care model, you have to literally know exactly the context in which what is being covered is actually covered. And I'll have lots of examples of that later on. And then finally, of course, is how much is being covered, right? The payment rate. So the combination of these three things is really important to understand in great detail. First, so to be reimbursed, the payer, so I want to use CMS, but insurance companies do the same thing, must first decide whether the device is covered, and if so, what is the payment rate, right? So what is being covered is the thing itself, and then the circumstances under which the thing can actually be used in order to provide the service, in order to provide the care. So the existence of a code is really just a technical convenience, right? It's a shorthand, it's a way of communicating between the provider and the payer. So rather than actually type out a long description of the thing that is being covered and the coverage and the amount of service provided, essentially all a provider does is provide a code, and then underneath that code are all of these conditions. And if the conditions are met, then the payer will then pay at the rate that the code specifies. Okay, so the point being that your device can have a code, so you could actually find a code that says, oh yeah, there is a CPT code for a device that looks like yours, or that described like yours, but it may not be covered and it may not be reimbursed. So getting the code is not good enough, or knowing the code is not good enough. All right. Now, there's this other aspect which is quite important, which is that when we are trying to get devices and therapies or services covered, we should not think of it as a sort of all or nothing situation, right? So very seldom are devices, or any kind of a covered a therapy, either not reimbursed or 100% reimbursed. National reimbursement means it's 100% reimbursed across all CMS locations. Very seldom does that happen. In fact, the good thing about CMS is that they're actually willing to support pilot studies that can have the potential to improve outcomes and that could actually be much more cost effective. Okay, so what you can do is you can develop a strategy that will allow you to seek an interim, coverage, like an add-on reimbursement or an add-on payment in the US context. And this is a lot of jurisdictions have this kind of a scheme, right? So in the US, there's something called the New Technology Add-on Payment, or the NTAP. And this is a situation where if you have a new technology, especially if it's designated as a breakthrough technology, and it promises potentially sort of significant new benefits, then you could actually apply for provisional coverage, which then allows you to deploy it, with a provider or a set of providers in order to collect data, right? In order to prove more substantively that you have a much better solution to an already covered condition at a lower cost, right? So these kinds of, if you will, partnering opportunities with payers actually does exist. So you want to look out for that, especially if you're developing something that you believe is sort of new, well, not maybe new to the world, but a significant improvement over what already exists. Okay. The other thing too is that you don't have to just depend on the good graces of CMS to do this. You could actually work with an insurer, a payer in your local region, and propose to them the possibility of providing temporary coverage or interim coverage so that you can sort of partially finance your technology development and data collection through this type of an arrangement, right? So don't think of reimbursement as like an all or nothing proposition, especially during your technology development phase. And the reason I mentioned this, as I said, is because you actually have to think about reimbursement during your technology development. A lot of companies make mistake by thinking of reimbursement after they have built the product, maybe even launched it, and then decided, hey, maybe I can get this thing reimbursed. That doesn't always succeed. And I would argue that, and I'll give you some examples, that oftentimes that does not succeed very well. So if you're going to go the reimbursement route, you got to start thinking about how you're going to get reimbursed during the development, during the design of a technology, because that's going to be your design is going to be affected by the coverage. Okay. And if the coverage language does not include your design, then you either have to redesign around it, or you have to apply for some variation to the appropriate society so that they can include your design specs into the coverage. Again, I will delve a little bit deeper into this. Now, I would say, I've made a point earlier that regardless of where you are around the world, for the most part, payers are going to consider two important dimensions to decide if something is even within striking distance of being reimbursable. Number one, and you should know this, that your new device or therapy has to provide significant clinical benefits. Okay, so that's going to be the first question to ask is, well, how does this compare with what already exists? Now, as we know, if you are doing, say, a drug trial or a device trial, that is actually part of the question that you have to answer, right? So for FDA specifically, to give you clearance for marketing of your device or the drug, ultimately you have to answer the question, is this thing better than what currently exists? So that data that you're collecting from those kinds of trials are actually useful as well for your reimbursement strategy. And you have to sort of like show it conclusively from the data. The second dimension, which the FDA, doesn't necessarily, care about as much, is this issue of the net positive economic benefit, right? So is it more cost effective than the current solution that is currently out there? And this is important because what that implies is that when you're doing your trials, right, you don't just want to collect clinical outcomes data, you actually want to design your trials in such a way that you can collect economic benefit data as well. Okay, so that's something that I think, obviously, if you're a large company, you can do that. If you're a small company, if you're a startup, you've got to pay attention to this thing. You can, of course, get contractors and specialists to help you design your trials so that you can collect that kind of data, but you should collect that kind of data. You can do it after the fact. It's very costly to do it after the fact. You want to do it while you're collecting other data. As we all know, as scientists, it's always better to collect the data once, completely, rather than to continue to go back and try to close data gaps. That's very costly to do. Now, so if your clinical trials can generate evidence that demonstrates compliance with the clinical and the economic benefits, then reimbursement is, of course, more likely, right? So the point here is that you want to think about both your clinical claims and your economic claims at the same time so that you can collect the supporting evidence, right, to back up your claims. So this issue of thinking about your claims, which is, what is your technology supposed to actually achieve? What are the outcomes it's supposed to provide, and how is it superior to what's out there, has to include both clinical as well as economic outcomes. Okay, so now, how do you go about actually developing a reimbursement strategy? So I use the word strategy very deliberately because you do have to be somewhat deliberate and forward thinking, thinking prospectively about your reimbursement plans. So the first step is to do what is called a reimbursement landscape or reimbursement landscaping. And here are some questions that you need to ask, right? So are similar or comparable devices already being reimbursed? So the best thing is to find out that there are comparable devices or therapies or care models that are already reimbursed. So there is a basis for you to make an argument that you can simply, piggyback on that coverage. The second piece, which is not difficult to do but does require a little bit of, shoe leather, is to figure out what specific codes are being used right now for the reimbursement. So 1 and 2 are sort of together, right? So you want to find out if something's been reimbursed and what are the actual codes. And you can go to cms.gov to find that, right? It's like a directory. You can type in descriptions, look for codes. And the other good thing about knowing the specific codes is you can actually do things like code stacking, right? So if you want to use public sources, there's a question there, go to cms.gov. Those things are published. Note that the CMS website gives you the codes, but then within your specific state, there might be additional codes as well. So, depending on what state you're developing your product or what state you think you're going to be selling your product into, you could find additional codes because, states do have other programs that can either extend the benefits for certain groups or certain kinds of capabilities of the technology. So that does require a little bit of work, but, get a good graduate student and just sit down for, 6 hours and do it. My students do that all the time. Then the third piece is the applicable coverage restrictions. So under the information that you get from looking at these codes is, number one, the criteria. right? So for example, certain kinds of drugs or certain kinds of therapies are only covered if it's like an adjuvant, or if it's a progression from from a simpler or a less invasive or a less risky therapy. All right. So the sequence sometimes matters. The sequence in which the therapy is actually being provided sometimes matters. So if this is you might not get coverage if your therapy is coded as something that can only happen after the patient gets A and B, right, and you are C, right, and if C is being prescribed as a first line treatment, then you might not get coverage there. So like it's very, very specific. The second thing is the indications, obviously, right? So as we know, there's lots of off-label prescribing going on. Sometimes that's covered, sometimes that's not covered. So it's very important to understand, what are the specific indications a particular treatment or a device or a drug is being used for. And then the third thing could be specific segments of the population. So I gave you an example of a pediatric versus adult population, right? And those things are defined. CMS defines pediatrics on an age basis, which is sort of a problem because actually pediatricians will tell you, age is loosely correlated. We are really looking at, a patient weight, size, etc. That's a whole different thing that we can get into. But the point is that you have to be very, very clear about what is actually being covered, and there are very specific dimensions that are listed. Okay, and so when you design your product, make sure that it falls within these coverage domains. And then, of course, the second big piece of developing your reimbursement strategy is understand the assigned payment rate. Okay. Now, what you will find oftentimes is there might be multiple codes that provide coverage with different payment rates. Okay, so you want to make sure that you understand what all of these codes are actually saying, and why the different rates may not be as important, but knowing that there are different rates, because sometimes you can stack your codes, meaning you can claim under several codes and you can add up these payment rates. Code stacking may or may not be allowed again under specific codes, so that's something to be aware of. So let's say you do your landscaping exercise and you find out that yes, an existing reimbursement mechanism exists. So if that's the case, the good news is you don't need to worry about the payers not paying, right? Essentially, if a code exists and your technology or your therapy falls nicely within all of the constraints, and the provider prescribes, then you're going to get paid. Okay? However, that doesn't mean that your job is over, right? First of all, you have to actually convince the provider to prescribe. And that's actually the case with new drugs that are launched that are sort of comparable to existing therapy. So a good example is Entresto. Entresto is a heart drug. It was launched with a lot of fanfare because it showed amazing clinical benefits. And heart drugs like statins are already reimbursed, and Entresto was going to be essentially reimbursed, under the same scheme. But the problem was that it took a while for providers to actually prescribe Entresto, because Entresto was this sort of new thing. And for most providers, for most doctors that are working with long-term cardiac patients, what we found in a sort of a informal study that we did talking to providers is that they would prefer to prescribe statins, stick with statins, because they know how it actually works with the patient, right? They understand the mechanism. They know how the patient will react. So if they have to adjust dosage and those kinds of things, they are fairly confident that they can get a good outcome for the patients. And these patients are, relatively speaking, fairly low risk. They're on maintenance. So for them to prescribe something like brand new, in spite of the amazing clinical outcome evidence, was something to them was a risk that wasn't actually worth taking. Not for those groups of patients that were stable and had a good a quality of life. So that's an issue. So you still have to talk to healthcare providers. You have to understand why they might prescribe something or not. So there's a lot of work that you still have to do, even if a reimbursement mechanism exists. It's simply a little bit simpler to get to market, because obviously you can tell the providers that if they're willing to prescribe, they don't have to worry about coverage, because providers do care about coverage for their patients. Many of them do. Okay. Now, if you have a new device that's not reimbursable, even though a reimbursement mechanism exists, there could be a number of factors that I talked about. First of all, the coding itself, right? So the assigned code for a similar device that is already in the marketplace actually excludes the new device, right? So you look at the code's descriptor, it might specify a certain kind of technology. It could be pneumatic or electric or mechanical, certain kinds of features, the number of channels, pressure ranges, the kind of material, right? So it's like really specific. And if your device happens to be different on any one of these dimensions, you run the risk that it will not get reimbursed. So now, does it mean that therefore you don't develop something that is novel? For example, if the material that you are utilizing is potentially more enduring, maybe cheaper, maybe more high performing, does it mean you abandon that? No, right? As I said, you can design according to the code, or you can go ahead and launch a product, but before you do that, to actually apply for inclusion of that specific dimension that provides a better performance into the existing code. And the way to do that is you lobby the coding entity. So the American Medical Association is one entity. Most of the major medical societies have something, have influence on the CPT codes, right? So the AMA is the big gorilla in the room, but you have got a lot of societies as well, the American Surgical Association, etc. They also provide codes, right, that payers look at in order to determine reimbursability. So you basically go to those societies and you lobby them to include a particular design dimension that may not be covered under an existing code. That takes time, but you can do that. I mean, manufacturers do that all the time. So other things that you want to think about as well is coverage, right? So if you don't end up getting covered, you might have payers that the payers themselves have coverage policies that exclude certain technologies. Okay, so for example, they might exclude certain applications, right? They might cover a treatment or diagnosis for one indication, but not for another indication. And as I said, maybe they only cover certain subsegments of the population, right? Adults and not children, or vice versa. So again, now, if that's the case, then you should approach the payers to modify or expand the coverage area. And of course, the question we'll ask you is, why should I do that? And your answer should be because it actually provides a superior clinical benefit for this subsegment of the population or this indication, and it's more cost effective. So that "and" is very important, right? It's not just good enough to say it provides a superior clinical benefit. I mean, well, I guess you can make that argument, and it's going to be up to the payer to decide whether that superior clinical benefit is truly superior, and then you're going to ask for more data. But certainly, if you can say that it's superior clinically and more cost effective, then the odds of getting a payer to expand coverage is much better. And then finally, the actual payment rate itself. So you might have coverage, you have a code, it meets all the standards that are required, but you know what, they're covering too low, right? The coverage is too low for you actually to make money. So what are your options? First, you can reprice the new device, right? So you can say, okay, I'll basically accept the current payment rate, but you may not necessarily you might not be able to necessarily do that because you could actually, you could be losing money, right? If you do that. So you want to sort of rethink, do I want to accept coverage? Could there be another revenue stream besides reimbursement that I could think of that would allow me to actually make money from this thing? Or you can develop a new reimbursement mechanism, right? So again, you go back to the coding entity and then you go back to the payer and say, hey, can I get a CPT code for this, device because it does all these great things. And the AMA says, yeah, we think this is wonderful. And, by the way, it's sort of in line with our strategy to promote, let's say, digital health, for example, right? Or AI, for example. So they could give you a code. Now, that takes time because they have committees that review these things. They look at the data that you provide, etc. And then you have to go to the payer and ask the payer to expand coverage basically on the same basis. So you can actually do this. Or you can redesign your technology so that it is less costly to make, right? And you can still make money from the lower payment rate. Okay, so there's sort of these different options. But again, especially for the third option, for you to have to go back to redesign your technology, that means that you need to understand your reimbursement landscape either before you nail down your technology design, right? Before you launch the product, or during the design phase, right? During the pilot testing phase. Let's say there's no reimbursement mechanism that currently exists. All right, so basically collect the data. And I've said already, the two kinds of data is clinical outcomes data, right? And I will tell you that especially in digital health, this has been a real barrier, right? So for those of you who are developing digital types of interventions or digital diagnostics, you have to be, so I know you're going to spend a lot of time collecting data, training data, let's say for an AI algorithm, right, to do diagnostics. You're going to spend a lot of time doing that, but you should think about spending an equal amount of time collecting data on the outcomes. So if you use this, if you test this diagnostic and you use it, what are the outcomes you should expect? Certainly, if you're looking at a digital intervention, outcomes are really, really important. So that's like just the first step, okay? Then the second thing is, and you need to do that for FDA clearance, and you sort of need FDA clearance anyway in order to get reimbursed. So you want to think about that. But more importantly, collecting data on the economic outcomes. So that's really critical. So there's a question about the typical timeline. That's not an easy answer, not an easy question to answer. And the way I would do that, because it sort of depends on, for example, if you're getting a new CPT code to society, what is that workload? What are the processes? So I can't give you an answer to that question. What I would do is I would say, first step is go find out if a code already exists. If it doesn't, then approach the medical society, right? That has jurisdiction over those kinds of codes. So the American Psychological Association, probably for mental health. Okay. Go to them, or the American Psychiatric Association for mental health. Go to them and then find out what is their process, and you can probably estimate how long it would take from there. Okay, so the data is really important. So I will just tell you that citing peer-reviewed published literature is not going to give you evidence for reimbursement. So you can't say, we have this intervention and the peer-reviewed literature suggests that this kind of intervention is effective. No, you actually have to show the original data from your own intervention, collected from your own trials. Okay, so that's like obvious, but I just want to state that, because if you're a startup, you got to think about this ahead of time, and doing trials do cost money. Okay, so the summary of your reimbursement strategy is that you need two things. You need a clear understanding of the reasons that inhibit current reimbursement, which means you need to know the reimbursement landscape. So do that. And if you don't feel that you can do that, you can actually hire consultants to do that for you. So that's an additional cost. Might be cheaper actually to hire a consultant. There are lots of companies that do this kind of thing, and you can go through that channel, but I would argue if even if you use a consultant, you should actually try to do this yourself. You should become familiar with that landscape, especially if this is going to be your primary revenue stream. The second advice I would give is don't pursue multiple reimbursement activities. Don't think, oh, this thing is great because they've got different indications, different applications, different population groups, and so I'm going to look for everything under the sun that could potentially reimburse this. That's a bad strategy, right? Because again, if you think about the coverage is very specific. And it may affect the design. It may not, but it may affect the design of your technology. So you want to be very focused. Okay, so develop a focused, what I call bespoke or custom reimbursement strategy for the market, the target market segment that's going to represent your primary or your core audience. I think that's like really important. So if you can go ahead and do that, then I think you are in good standing going forward. All right, some implementation notes. This is the piece that I think could be interesting. So, you're going to craft out your reimbursement landscape strategy. You're going to think about your revenue model, and so reimbursement is maybe a part of that. So, number one, plan your reimbursement strategy during technology development. I keep saying that over and over again. So here's an example. Okay, so without naming it, there's a company that developed the force sensor product, right? The force sensor product is clinically better. It is less expensive because it's 4 versus 6 sensors, which is the current industry standard right now. And in fact, the existing reimbursement mechanism had all the codes, they were paying, good money, etc. But they couldn't get reimbursed because in the existing codes, the coverage actually specified 6 sensors. So you come up with 4 sensors and say, sorry, this is not a technology that we're going to reimburse you for. By the time they figured that out, they already had the product basically nailed down and manufactured. And so to go back and redesign and remanufacture is too costly. So as far as reimbursement goes, that company, that channel, that revenue stream was not available to that company. Maybe in version 2 of the product or something like that. So there's another company that launched a wound treatment product. So this is like a device that applies pressure to traumatic wounds to hasten healing. So what was happening was that they had actually varied the pressure settings because it was supposed to provide better benefit. The problem was that under the specific coverage language, the pressure settings that they used, right, that the product used was outside of the range, right? So when I say specific, I literally mean it's that specific. So you really want to understand what the technical requirements are for something to be covered, like especially a device, right? If it's a drug, it's the indication or the set of indications. So it's very important to verify that the existing data that you're collecting supports the reimbursable clinical and economic claims, or you want to add those claims for data collection in the clinical study protocol. And again, as I said, make sure that your device specifications at least falls within the ranges that that coverage provides. Consider your reimbursement strategy early. All right, so don't launch the product based only on R&D, regulatory criteria, or marketing, because I know we focus a lot on making sure that your product can meet regulatory criteria, especially if you want to get a 510(k) stamp or something from the FDA. You don't have to do that for every device. Certainly, if the device falls under class, an invasive device, something like that, you can't sell it without FDA clearance. But if it's something that is fairly benign, low risk, a lot of companies will want a 510(k) because it's a marketing or a branding thing. That's fine, right? But in your actual product development itself, here's some examples of why you don't just want to focus on R&D, regulation, or marketing. So there's a company that developed a platform that could be applied to a bunch of applications, right? So the reimbursement strategy was being actually developed during a pivotal trial for the first application. Turned out that the reimbursement was too low for that application. So at that time of the trial, the company was able to actually pivot, right, to a different application, which was actually reimbursed at a higher rate, right? And it was reimbursed immediately the moment the company was able to get a CE mark for that particular device. So that's the benefit of thinking about reimbursement while you're developing your device, because you can actually aim your clinical trial or pivot the application to an area that could be actually more profitable. It doesn't mean that you abandon your other applications, maybe because you had developed your technology for that application. But what it means is that you could now have hopefully multiple revenue streams, one of which is actually reimbursed at a higher level. Okay. So the bottom line is that your reimbursement strategy could affect the launch application of the product. So if you have a product with multiple applications, the launch application, your minimum viable product that you're going to go to market with, should be at least reimbursed at the rate that allows you to make enough money to keep, with development or to stabilize the company at launch for growth. Don't focus only on the regulatory aspect. So this is another final point of what I just said, right? So here's an example of a company that developed really good clinical data for their product and then started developing reimbursement mechanisms. Now, the payers were happy with the clinical evidence, but then because they want the cost-effective data and they didn't collect it, you now have to actually go back and collect the new economic data, all right, which might mean a new set of maybe smaller trials, but nonetheless, you're losing time and it's going to cost you more. So try to do those things together, all right? Build a cost-effective analysis assessments into the data collection when you're testing your technology, for efficacy. Do it together. So now, just because regulatory clearance comes before reimbursement. So let me just tell you that if you want to go down the reimbursement route, you need to get regulatory clearance. It's as simple as that, right? Payers are not going to reimburse something that is not regulatorily cleared. For certain categories, devices, drugs, etc. Okay. For therapeutic procedures, that's different. And for care models, that's different. So, for example, if you develop a hospital at home care option, let's say for a chronic disease, and that's reimbursable, that doesn't necessarily have to be FDA cleared. I mean, there's no FDA clearance mechanism for procedures anyway. But just because you need regulatory clearance before reimbursement doesn't mean that you think of it as a zero process. You think of it as a parallel process. Okay, so there's a company, another example, that started work on this reimbursement strategy after receiving regulatory clearance, right? The problem was that the wording used in the regulatory application decreased the likelihood of reimbursement. So what does that mean? That means that the regulatory application had a series of claims, sort of clinical claims, which met regulatory standards, but they were too narrow, right? So they were too narrow. And so something could be regulatorily approved, but it could be reimbursed because those claims were either, too narrow or didn't quite fit the coverage language. So you want to think about, the claims you're making, right, for the regulatory authorities and the claims that could be reimbursed by the payers. Again, together, make sure that they at least don't conflict with one another, or that one is, out of scope of the other. Okay. So a short regulatory path does not mean optimal reimbursement. That's just another way of saying what I just said. Just because you can get something cleared quickly doesn't mean that you're also going to get reimbursed very quickly, right? It's a little bit more of an involved process with reimbursement. All right, so that's I'm done, and we've got about 5-6 minutes left. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Just type it up in the Q&A. Otherwise, as I said, this will be recorded, and of course you can go back and review it at your own time. So if there are no questions, I'll be happy to give you back your 5 minutes for lunch. Oh, I'm sorry. So yeah, okay, so there's a point here. Several hospital systems were then they were talking with have expressed RPM reimbursements isn't profitable. That could be true. That could be true. And so, your strategy is to, look for hospital systems that think it could work or develop other revenue streams, right? As I said, if you look at the examples I gave you, your revenue streams can be as myriad and as creative as your imagination. Okay. So for example, you can go to the payer and, the other thing you can do is if you can't get directly reimbursed is you could bundle it. Let's say it's a device, right? That actually improves provider efficiency, right? So that's usually not reimbursable, but, a hospital might be willing to pay if it increases provider capacity or safety or efficiency, or basically leads to better outcomes for their patient, or leads to more cost-effective care. So, I emphasize reimbursement because it's like a bit more complicated, right? As a revenue source in healthcare, you don't see this kind of a revenue source in other industries, but at the same time, it doesn't mean you couldn't have other kinds of revenue streams. Yeah. So John Corky's point says that the hospital systems were saying the RPM reimbursement isn't profitable, but the data that comes from RPM may have benefits like reduced readmittances to ED. Correct, right? So the question is, how much of a reduction? Now, here's where I think you can think about which particular, which state. So in Maryland, for example, right, we use a capitated system in Maryland. What that means is that if you can significantly reduce readmissions to ED, that's actually money on the barrel for the hospital, because hospitals are not just not compensated. In Maryland, they're actually, after a certain level, punished for having excessive readmissions, for certain conditions. So if you can show the hospital that, guess what, I could actually reduce that significantly for you, the hospital might say, let's do a profit sharing or let's do a cost sharing arrangement. Okay, so it's a revenue stream, but it's like a cost sharing revenue stream. You reduce costs for them by using their technology, and they pay you a share of the costs that you reduce for them. Okay, it's all in the negotiation. So I think so the hospital's not going to reimburse, but they might say, hey, it's worth for us to do this. Alaska is the other state that actually has a capitated system, so you could sort of think of that. If those are too small, then again, as I said, you got to think about sort of other ways of building a revenue stream. It could be multiple revenue streams to make up your revenue model. I hope that's helpful. I know it's very general, but ultimately, it's the devil is always in the details, as they say, right? Yeah, so there are CMS preventive health quality bonuses. Yeah, that's correct. What are best practices in healthcare that provide data and selling to health plans? Well, first of all, you have to collect the data. And I think the way you think about it is look at who the major players are. You have to do this, unfortunately, state by state, because unfortunately, the system that we have in this country doesn't allow sort of a more sort of a national coverage. The coverage actually varies by state, even for the same company, same payer company. So I would say, look for the major payer and then basically approach them and say, hey, we've got data to show X. And especially if a particular indication or a particular condition is a major cost item in healthcare expenditures in that state, you can imagine that private payers will face similar issues as well. And so I think that's the way you would sort of make that argument, is that I could save you X dollars. So you have to actually show on a per patient basis how much dollars could actually be saved relative to how much a payer would be spending. And that's just part of your research that you have to do during the technology development stage. So again, the sort of specific answer is going to be dependent on the specific technology. But I hope that at least this gives you, some sense of an approach that you could use. So Anne is sort of telling me that I'm out of time. It's exactly 1 p.m. Again, if you are interested, you can just send us, so we have the questions in the Q&A, and if I didn't answer them, correctly, not correctly, but completely, I will, write up an FAQ and send it around to everyone. Okay, and feel free to ask your questions to myself or to others in the AITCs, because we are here to help you succeed. Have a great day.